It didn't happen gradually. There was no warning, no slow decline, no time to prepare. One day everything was stable, structured, predictable, and the next it was gone, completely. The kind of loss that doesn't just take things from you, it takes the version of you that existed before it. Because when everything changes at once, you don't just adjust, you reset. And resets aren't clean. They're disorienting, confusing. Hard to process in real time. That night I wasn't thinking about recovery. I wasn't thinking about solutions. I was just trying to understand how something that felt permanent could disappear so quickly. And in that moment, there's only one instinct people usually have: to go somewhere familiar, somewhere safe, somewhere that still feels like it belongs to you. For me, that place was my son. I didn't call him first. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Some situations are too large to fit into a conversation. They require context, detail, time. And when everything collapses at once, you don't have those things ready. So instead, I went directly to him, not with a plan, not with a clear explanation, just with the assumption that presence would be enough. Because sometimes just being there is all you think you need. The drive there didn't feel long, even though it should have. Because when your mind is processing something overwhelming, time doesn't move normally. It compresses, expands, loses structure completely. I remember stopping at a signal and not even realizing how long I had been sitting there until someone honked behind me. That's how disconnected everything felt. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just unreal. When I finally reached his place, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the door and knocked, not aggressively, not urgently, just firmly enough to be heard. Because at that moment I still believed this was simple. That I would explain, he would understand, and things would move forward from there. Maybe not perfectly, but together. He opened the door after a few seconds, and for a brief moment nothing felt wrong. He looked the same. The space behind him looked the same. Everything appeared normal, and that's what made what happened next feel even more disconnected from expectation. He didn't step aside. He didn't ask me to come in. He just stood there, looking at me, not with confusion, not with concern, but with something else, something more controlled, more distant, the kind of expression that doesn't react because it has already decided something. "What happened?" he asked. The question was direct, but the tone behind it didn't match urgency. It was measured, almost cautious. As if he wasn't asking to understand, he was asking to confirm something he already suspected. I explained as simply as I could. Not every detail, just the core of it, that things had changed, that everything I had built was gone, that I needed time to figure out what came next. And while I spoke, I watched his expression carefully, waiting for something to shift. For concern, for empathy, for anything that felt like support, but nothing changed, not immediately, not even slightly. And that's when the first real feeling set in, not panic, not anger, but confusion. Because when you expect a certain reaction and it doesn't come, your mind starts trying to fill the gap. And then he said something I didn't expect. Not loudly, not harshly, just clearly. "I can't help you," and before I could respond, he stepped back and slammed the door in my face. The sound of that door didn't echo loudly, but it stayed, not in the air, but in the mind. Because some moments don't need repetition to leave an impact. They settle instantly, quietly, permanently. I didn't knock again, not because I didn't want to, but because something in that moment made it clear that knocking wouldn't change anything. This wasn't hesitation, it wasn't confusion, it was a decision, and decisions like that don't reverse easily. So I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, not waiting for the door to open, but understanding that it wouldn't. Walking away from that door felt heavier than losing everything else. Because financial loss, no matter how sudden, still exists outside of you. It affects your environment, your structure, your stability. But rejection like that, it lands somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to separate from yourself. And that's what made the difference, because I didn't go there just for help. I went there for connection, and what I found instead was distance. The drive back wasn't the same as the drive there. Before, my mind was trying to process what had happened. Now it wasn't trying to process, it was trying to understand. Not the loss, but him. Because moments like that don't appear randomly. They come from somewhere, built over time, shaped by things that weren't addressed when they should have been. And that's when the past starts to resurface. Not all at once, but in pieces, small memories. Conversations, decisions, the kind you don't question when they happen, but later realize carried more weight than you understood at the time. I had always believed I was doing what was necessary, providing, building, creating stability for the future. the kind of focus that demands time, energy, attention, often at the cost of presence. And at the time, it made sense, because results were visible, progress was measurable, and everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. But what isn't visible is what's happening in the background, the moments you miss, the conversations you delay, the presence you replace with intention. Because intention doesn't always translate into impact. Looking back, there were signs, subtle, easy to overlook, the way he responded less over time, the way conversations became shorter, more direct, less open. Not confrontational, but distant, and distance, when it grows slowly, often goes unnoticed until it becomes obvious. I never asked him directly what he felt, not because I didn't care, but because I assumed understanding. And assumption is where most misalignment begins. From his perspective, things might have looked different, not as effort, not as sacrifice, but as absence, as prioritization of something else over him. And when that perception builds over time, it becomes belief. And beliefs, once formed, don't change easily. They solidify, they shape reactions, they influence decisions, especially in moments where emotion is involved. Standing at that door, I wasn't just facing his reaction. I was facing everything that led to it, every missed moment, every delayed conversation, every time I chose progress over presence, believing I was doing the right thing. Because sometimes what feels right in the moment doesn't feel right in the long run. And by the time you realize it, the impact has already been made. That night wasn't just about loss, it was about realization. Not loud, not dramatic. Just clear, because clarity doesn't always come from success. Sometimes it comes from moments you can't ignore. And that door was one of those moments. It didn't just close physically, it closed something else. Something that had already been weakening long before that night. And now there was no way to pretend it wasn't there anymore. That night didn't end with a plan. It didn't even end with a clear direction. It ended with a quiet kind of uncertainty that doesn't panic but doesn't settle either. I didn't go anywhere specific after leaving his place. I just drove, not fast, not aimlessly, just forward. Because sometimes movement feels like the only thing that keeps you from stopping completely. And stopping in moments like that feels heavier than continuing without direction. Eventually, I found myself parked in a place that didn't matter, a dimly lit area with no real significance. And I sat there longer than I intended, not thinking about solutions, not trying to fix anything, just letting the weight of everything exist without resistance. Because when too many things collapse at once, trying to rebuild immediately doesn't help. It overwhelms, and overwhelm doesn't create progress, it creates more confusion. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I allowed things to remain unresolved for a moment, not as avoidance, but as acknowledgement. Because not every situation needs to be solved instantly. Some need to be understood first, and that understanding doesn't come from action. It comes from stillness. The next morning didn't offer clarity, it offered reality, and reality is different from reflection. Reflection stays internal. Reality shows you what still needs to function despite everything that's changed. There were things to handle, calls that couldn't be ignored, responsibilities that didn't disappear just because circumstances had shifted. And facing those things without the structure I was used to felt unfamiliar, not impossible. Just different enough to remind me that nothing was the same anymore. But even in that difference, there was something subtle happening. A shift in how I approached things, not rushed, not reactive, just more aware. Because when stability is removed, you stop relying on it. And when you stop relying on it, you start paying attention in ways you didn't before. Every decision becomes more deliberate, every action more considered. Not because you want it to be, but because it has to be. I didn't reach out to him again. Not that day, not the next, not even out of impulse. Because something had changed in the way I understood that relationship. Before, it felt accessible, open, assumed. Now it felt conditional, not in a negative way, but in a defined way, and definitions, once clear, don't leave much room for assumption anymore. I realized that going back immediately wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change what had already been expressed, because reactions in moments like that aren't random, they're built. And anything built over time doesn't dissolve in a single conversation. So instead of trying to repair it instantly, I chose something different, distance, not as rejection, but as space. Space to understand what had happened without forcing it into resolution too quickly. Because forced resolution doesn't create real change, it just creates temporary comfort. The days that followed weren't dramatic. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no instant recoveries, no clear turning points. just small, consistent efforts to rebuild structure where it had been lost, and those efforts didn't feel significant in the moment. They felt repetitive, basic, almost unimportant. But that's the thing about rebuilding, it rarely feels powerful while it's happening. It feels slow, quiet, sometimes even frustrating, because you remember what used to exist and what you're doing now feels far from it. But comparison doesn't help progress, it delays it. So I stopped comparing. Not completely, but enough to focus on what was in front of me instead of what used to be behind me. And that shift, small as it was, started to change something internally. Not confidence, not yet, but direction. There were moments, though, when everything came back at once. Not triggered by anything specific, just sudden waves of thought that brought everything together again. The loss, the door, the silence that followed. And in those moments, it would have been easy to assign blame, to direct the frustration outward, to simplify the situation into something easier to carry. But I didn't, not because it wasn't tempting, but because it wouldn't have been accurate. What happened wasn't caused by one thing. It wasn't the result of a single decision or a single moment. It was layered, built over time. An understanding that didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. And clarity, even when it's difficult, is more useful than comfort. Slowly, without noticing exactly when it started, something began to stabilize. Not externally, things were still in progress, but internally. The constant noise of confusion started to quiet down. Not disappear, but reduce enough to allow focus. And focus, once it returns, changes everything. Because with focus, effort becomes structured again, decisions become intentional, and movement, even if slow, becomes meaningful. I wasn't back where I had been, not even close, but I wasn't where I started either. And that difference, even if small, mattered more than it seemed. I began to rebuild routines, simple ones at first. Things that created consistency without requiring too much energy. Because energy at that stage wasn't unlimited. It had to be managed, directed carefully toward things that actually moved me forward. And as those routines became stable, something else followed: momentum. Not fast, not obvious, but enough to feel like things were progressing again. And progress, even when minimal, creates something powerful. It creates belief. Not in outcomes, but in process. The thought of him didn't disappear, it surfaced often, but it changed, from confusion to understanding, from reaction to observation. Because once you step back far enough, you start seeing things in context instead of isolation. And context reveals things that moments alone don't. It showed me not just what happened, but why it might have happened, not to justify it, but to understand it. And understanding, even without agreement, reduces resistance. There was no plan yet to reconnect, no strategy to fix what had broken, just an awareness that something needed time, real time, not forced conversations or immediate explanations, because some things don't respond to urgency. They respond to space, and space, when used correctly, doesn't create distance, it creates perspective. And somewhere in that space, something began to change. Not around me, but within me. Progress didn't arrive as a single moment. It didn't feel like a breakthrough or a sudden return to what used to exist. It came in fragments, small improvements that on their own didn't seem significant, but together began to form something stable again. The kind of progress that isn't visible to others immediately, but becomes undeniable over time. And that's what started to happen. Slowly, without any announcement, the structure I had lost began to rebuild itself, not in the same way as before, but in a way that felt more intentional. Because this time I wasn't just building for results, I was building with awareness. Every decision carried more weight, not because the stakes were higher, but because I understood what could happen if I ignored the details again. And that awareness changed how everything moved forward. Opportunities didn't come back all at once. They appeared gradually, often in forms that didn't look like opportunities at first. Smaller projects, limited commitments. Situations that required effort without immediate return. And earlier, I might have overlooked them, waiting for something bigger, something more aligned with what I had before. But now I saw them differently, not as replacements, but as steps. Because rebuilding isn't about finding something equal to what was lost. It's about creating something that leads somewhere new. And that shift in perspective allowed me to move without hesitation, not chasing outcomes, but focusing on direction. As things started to stabilize externally, something else became clearer internally. The silence between me and my son had remained unchanged. No calls, no messages, no attempts from either side to reopen what had closed that night. And while that silence could have felt heavy, it didn't, not anymore, because it had been replaced by something else: understanding. not agreement, not resolution, just a recognition of what existed between us now. And that recognition removed the urgency to fix it immediately, because not everything needs to be fixed quickly. Some things need to evolve on their own. Then one day, unexpectedly, his name appeared again, not directly, but through someone else. A casual mention, nothing dramatic, just a reference in conversation that connected him back into my awareness in a different way. And what I heard wasn't negative, it wasn't conflict. It was something simpler. He was struggling, not visibly. Not publicly, but enough for it to be noticeable to those around him, and hearing that didn't create satisfaction. It didn't feel like balance or reversal. It just added another layer to everything that had already happened. Because struggle, when it appears on both sides, changes perspective. It removes the idea that one person is right and the other is wrong. It replaces it with something more complex, something that recognizes that both sides are dealing with their own version of the situation. And that realization doesn't solve anything immediately, but it shifts how you approach what comes next. I didn't reach out immediately after hearing it, not because I didn't want to, but because timing matters. And not all moments are the right ones to reconnect. Some require space to fully develop before they can be addressed, and rushing into that space too early can disrupt something that needs to settle first. So I waited. Not passively, but intentionally, watching how things unfolded, allowing time to do what it naturally does, create clarity. Meanwhile, everything I was rebuilding continued to grow, not dramatically, but consistently. And consistency over time becomes something powerful, because it doesn't rely on momentum, it creates it. And that momentum started to shift my position again, not back to where I had been, but towards something that felt more stable than before. Because this time, it wasn't built on assumption, it was built on awareness. The difference showed not just in results, but in how I carried myself. There was less urgency, less need to prove anything, less attachment to immediate outcomes. And that shift affected how others responded as well, because people don't just respond to what you do, they respond to how you do it. And when that changes, everything around it begins to adjust too. Eventually, the moment came. Not planned, not forced, just natural. A situation where reconnecting didn't feel like a decision, it felt like the next step. And when that moment arrived, it didn't carry tension. It didn't feel heavy. It felt neutral. And neutrality in situations like this is important, because it allows things to move forward without being weighed down by what came before. And just like that, the door that had once been slammed shut was about to open again. When the moment finally came, it didn't feel dramatic. There was no build-up, no emotional tension hanging in the air, no sense that something major was about to happen. It was simple, almost ordinary, and maybe that's why it mattered more. Because when something real begins to shift, it doesn't always announce itself, it just presents the opportunity. I saw him again in a setting that didn't belong to either of us. Neutral ground. A place where neither of us had control, which somehow made it easier. There were no expectations attached to that space, no memories tied to it, no pressure to act a certain way. And that neutrality created something important, a chance to interact without carrying everything that had happened into the moment. At first, neither of us spoke, not out of tension, but out of adjustment. Because when distance exists for long enough, even familiarity needs time to return. We weren't strangers, but we weren't the same as before either. And acknowledging that silently felt more honest than pretending everything was normal. He looked at me briefly, then away, then back again, not avoiding, just processing, and I understood that, because I had done the same thing just at a different time. "You look different," he said finally. The words weren't deep, but the tone behind them carried something more, not judgment, not criticism, just observation. And observation, when it's genuine, often replaces everything that doesn't need to be said directly. "So do you," I replied, and that was enough to start. Not a full conversation, not a resolution, just a beginning. Because sometimes the first step isn't about fixing anything, it's about reopening something that was closed. We didn't talk about that night immediately, not because it didn't matter, but because bringing it up too early would have shifted the moment into something heavier than it needed to be. Instead, we spoke about simple things, current situations. What had been happening recently, not avoiding the past, but not forcing it into the present either. And in those small exchanges, something started to rebuild. Not trust, not yet, but comfort. The ability to exist in the same space without resistance, and that in itself was progress. Eventually, the conversation paused, not awkwardly, just naturally. And in that pause, the past finally made its way in, not through accusation, Not through explanation, just through presence. That night, he started, then stopped, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wasn't sure how to say it, and that hesitation said more than words could have. I know, I said quietly, not to interrupt, but to remove pressure, because sometimes people don't need to explain everything. They just need to know that it's already understood. He nodded, slowly. And that nod carried something important, not agreement, not resolution, but acknowledgement. I wasn't ready, he said after a moment, and that sentence, simple as it was, clarified more than any detailed explanation could have. Because readiness isn't just about ability, it's about perspective, and perspective at that time hadn't aligned. I didn't expect you to be, I replied, and that was the truth, not then, maybe not even now. But expectations weren't the focus anymore. We didn't go deeper than that, not because there wasn't more to say, but because not everything needs to be said at once. Some things rebuild gradually, through consistency rather than conversation. And that's what this became, not a sudden repair, not a complete return, but a gradual shift towards something more stable. The relationship didn't go back to what it was, and it didn't need to, because what it became was more aware. More defined, less assumed, and sometimes that's better than what existed before, because relationships built on assumption break easily, but relationships built on understanding last differently. As for everything else, the loss, the struggle, the rebuild, it all remained part of the story, not erased, not forgotten, but integrated, because those moments didn't just take something away, they added something to perspective. And perspective changes how everything is seen moving forward. I didn't need him to fix what happened, just like he didn't need me to explain everything I had done before, because at some point, understanding replaces expectation. And when that happens, things stop feeling broken. They just feel different, and different isn't always worse. Sometimes it's exactly what was needed. He didn't slam the door again, and I didn't knock the same way either. Because both of us had changed in ways that didn't require explanation, and that change was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but real, and real is what lasts. I lost everything overnight. But what I found after was something I didn't have before: clarity. And clarity is more valuable than anything that was lost, because once you have it, you don't build the same way again, and this time, that was exactly the point. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what really matters, and sometimes the doors that close on you are the ones that teach you how to rebuild yourself.